Alright guys, so we're back with, I guess, episode 9. Today we're going to talk about loops. So let's get into it. So loops are a control structure, like an if-else statement that we've gone over in, I think, episode 4 or 5. And they pretty much direct the path of a program, right? Remember, when we have if this condition, then do this. Otherwise, do something else, okay? Now, loops allow iteration for one or more programming statements, right? I say one or more because you can either do only one thing or you can do a group of things until a desired amount is reached, right? So let's say if you want to loop from 1 to 1,000, right? How many iterations is that? That's 1,000 iterations. Or you can loop indefinitely until you get some desired result. Okay, so, and again, let's say again, if you wanted to add all numbers from 1 to 100, instead of manually like writing out all the numbers and using the addition operator, you can just write a loop that iterates 100 times, summing each number during each iteration. Okay, so for example, some people would say, oh wait, whoops, let me exit. Some people would go into their text editor and they would be like, oh, you know what, let me go ahead and just sum all numbers from 1 to 10, and I'll be like, okay, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7 plus 8 plus 9 plus 10, right? Obviously, this would work. The result of that would be 55, I think, okay, and that would be fine. You'd be like, okay, well, I was able to sum all numbers from 1 to 10. Why can't I just do that from 1 to 100? And you certainly could. There's nothing stopping you. You just continue on. Plus 11, plus 12, plus 13, plus 14, plus 15, plus 16, plus 17, plus 18. And you just keep going. You might make a mistake somewhere. You might accidentally type 22 times, right? And you'd probably not even get the right result. And you might get it though. But what if you want to do 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 1 million or 1 billion? Okay, and that might be a little bit crazy to actually sit there and write out all of those numbers and all of those plus signs. It'd be very, very tedious, very, very annoying. Fortunately, we have loop structures. We can use loops to solve these problems for us. We can repeat a certain process as many times as we want until we get the desired result that we wish. Okay, so before we even get into loops, let's talk a little bit about the different types of loop structures. So there's actually 3. There's a while loop, a for loop, and a DoWhile loop. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and look at the while loop first. Okay, so the while loop is a pretest loop, okay, and all that means is that the condition is always checked before its body is executed. And for you to understand that, you would have to look at the syntax of a while loop. Okay, so just remember how when we were talking about if-else statements, in order for the body of an if statement, right? So let's say if I had something like, I don't know, let y equal 5, and we have an if statement like if y less than 100, right? Then we're going to say y is less than 100. And then if I do node ep9, it's going to say 5 is less than 100. I'm not sure why that was logged like that. That was weird. 5 is less than 100, just like that, right? Perfect. Okay, and we can see that this condition was satisfied, and because that condition was true, we can execute all of the programming statements inside the body of this if statement, of this if clause. Okay, and it's the same way the while loop works, right? So if we change this to a while, and we have some condition, right? We have y less than 100, and we would execute the body of this loop. However, the only difference is that the while loop is just going to execute repeatedly, over and over again. So if we were actually to run this, right, you're going to see that it's actually going to iterate a bunch of times. You can see that it's buffering. It keeps on looping over and over again. That's because we don't have any control of this loop right now. We're not controlling this loop with our variable. And that's the next thing that I want to talk about. Okay, so loops must have a condition. Okay, they must have they don't really necessarily need a body, but, well, actually, no, they do need a body. I'm sorry. They need a body, and the body is pretty much a collection of programming statements that you want to execute. In this case, we are only logging to the console, and they also need a loop control variable. That part is important. Okay, so I have an example over here, but we're actually going to go over to our text editor over here. So let's just start this over again. So let's declare a variable. Let's call this 0, or let's call it y and give it the value of 0. And we're going to go ahead and specify a condition. We want to loop 100 times. Okay, so I want to print out all of the numbers from 0 up to 99, or I should say 1 to 100. So our condition is going to change to y less than or equal to 100. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to print out all numbers from 1 to 100. Okay, so if I go ahead and if I log y right now, the first iteration y is going to be 1. Okay, however, what about the next iteration? Okay, we're not updating y, so the next iteration is just going to be 1, and then the next iteration is going to be 1, and then we can go through 100 iterations and the y is still going to be 1. The value of y never changed, so this condition is actually going to stay true forever, right? And you can see if I go ahead and run this, it's going to keep printing out 1. Okay, it doesn't stop. It's running infinitely. And this is why we need what's called a loop controlled variable, which pretty much controls the loop in a sense. So for example, we have y, right? This condition over here, y less than 100, less than or equal to 100, the variable y itself is never being updated. And since it's not being updated, this loop is never going to terminate. The condition is never eventually going to reach a point where it's going to evaluate to false. And that's bad because if it never evaluates to false, you're going to have an infinite loop, okay? And that's really bad. So what we need to do is we need to increment by 1. Okay, the reason why we're incrementing by 1 is because we want to print out every single number from 1 to 100 inclusively. You don't have to increment by 1. You can increment by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and I'll show you those examples in just a sec. So let's actually run this, and you're going to see that it logs all the numbers from 1 up to 100. Okay, and again, so remember, we're using the incremental operator, which I covered in the previous video. So it's good that we actually talked about that before we covered the loop part, okay? But this part is where we are updating the value of y. So in the first iteration, y is 1. We can see that y is less than or equal to 100. That part is true. So we print out y to the console, where you can see we have 1. And then we increment y at the very end. Notice how we're not incrementing y over here. We're incrementing y at the very end. I mean, if we increment the y up here, it would actually log 2 to I think 100 instead of 1 to 100. I mean, we can just go ahead and do that, and we can see that actually it logs it up to 101, which is not what we wanted. So it's very important on where you're updating your loop controlled variable. Okay, so because we want to print all numbers from 1 to 100, we increment by 1. Whoops, let me save this again. We can also increment by 2. Let's say we want to print all numbers that are multiple by 2. So we can start from 0, and we can say, okay, 0 plus equal 2. So we can add by 2. And you're going to see that every number is being printed out is divisible by 2. So we have 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Okay, and this iteration is actually, the amount of times this loop executed was 50 times. It repeated 50 times. We can also change it to 5, or 5, right? And you're going to see we have 5, 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, etc. Okay, and I mean, we can also do it up here too. Y plus equals 5. And we can change this to less than 100. And kind of just play around with and modify, right? We can also change it to every 10th number. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And this executed 10 times. So you can kind of see like what we can do with loops. We can control the amount of times it's being executed using the loop control variable, or we can just change the condition. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so just remember that the way it works is we are checking the condition first. Remember, the while loop is a pretest loop, so we always check the condition first, and then if that condition is met, we then execute the body. And eventually, if the condition is going to be false, and that's when the loop is going to terminate. It's going to exit for good. Okay. One more thing I want to mention is that you can also terminate a loop very early. So, for example, let's do this. Let's go ahead and so let's just execute this loop one time and then just terminate early, right? And you can use it. You can do that by using the break statement or the break keyword. So you can do break semicolon, and you're gonna see 10. Perfect, right? Cool. You notice how it only looped one time, right? Because basically, the first iteration y is 0. 0 is less than 100. We add 10 to y using the combined assignment operator. We log 10 to the console, and then we break. So that terminates the loop, it exits the loop, and we continue on with our program. Just like that. And we can see exit loop just like that. Just wanted to mention that because it is very important you guys understand how to terminate loops, because there might be a point where you might not know how many times you want to iterate, right? The while loop is perfect for iterating an indefinite amount of times, okay? And so you might not know how many times you want to iterate, but it might come to a point where you have the desired result that you need. And so you want to terminate the loop immediately. Okay, so a good example would be, let's declare a flag or a Boolean value. Let's call this true. Now, this is not really a good way to use loops. You never want to have a while true loop because I think it's just bad practice from the way I learned from what other people have told me from other senior developers. It's not good to have a while true loop, but as long as you have as long as you're able to terminate at some point, then it should be fine. But I'm just showing this for demonstration purposes, okay? So let's say we have while true, okay? I could have also just done this, okay? And what I want to do is, I want to keep looping I want to keep adding numbers until we get a number that is both divisible by 3 and 5. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's keep the variable y, and what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if y during each iteration is divisible by 3 or 5. And to do that, all we do is we say y mod 3. We check if the remainder is 0, right? We're basically saying, okay, 0 mod 3 is the value of that 0. Okay, because if it is 0, that means the number is divisible by 3. Okay? And we also want to make sure it's divisible by 5. So we're going to use what's called a logical operator, which I covered in, I think, a couple of episodes ago, to join two conditions together to form one condition. Okay, so we want to make sure that this number y, whatever number it is, it's arbitrary. This number y is both divisible by 3 and it's also divisible by 5. So we're going to say y mod 5 equals 0. So basically we're saying, okay, y divided by 3, does it have a remainder of 0? If it is, that means that it's divisible by 3. And if y mod 5, if that value evaluates to 0, then that means it's divisible by 5. And if we say, okay, constant.log, we're going to say y is divisible by both 3 and 5. And we can break. And so we can see that this value, this loop is going to terminate eventually. Because there is a number that's divisible by both 3 and 5, and that's 15, okay? And we also need to update y, because otherwise y is going to stay at 0 forever. So let's update y, okay? And we want to do this outside of the if, because we want to update y during every single iteration, and not inside this if condition, okay? So let's run that, and you're going to see 0, actually, no, I'm sorry, that should be 1. Let's start at 1. Okay, 0, that is true, 0 is divisible by 3 and 5, but let's start at 1, okay? And you're going to see 15 is divisible by both 3 and 5. Okay, and we can be a little bit more fancy. We can say, okay, let's make this a little bit more complicated, right? Let's print out the first 3 numbers that are divisible by both 3 and 5. Okay, so let's keep another counter. Let's say count equals 0. Okay, and inside this if condition, I want to have another if condition. So we're going to have a nested if condition. Okay, so if y is divisible by 3 and 5, let's update count. Okay, so we're gonna say count plus plus, and then we're going to say, okay, if count, we're gonna check if count is equal, let's see, I guess we set the first 3, so greater than or equal. Well, actually, we could do just equal. So if count is equal to 3, we're going to say break. Okay, we only want the first 3 numbers that are divisible by 3 and 5. Okay, and notice how I don't need any curly braces because I only have one line that needs to be conditionally executed after the if statement. Okay, if I had multiple lines, like if I wanted to log something out over here, I would have to say done, like that, right? Then I would need to make sure that I wrap this inside a set of curly braces, right? Because if I didn't have curly braces here, this console.log would be conditionally executed when this is the case, but this break would happen every single time, so this would be semantically wrong. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. Let's run this, and you're going to see 15 is divisible by both 3 and 5, 30 is divisible by both 3 and 5, 45 is divisible by both 3 and 5. We got our 3 numbers, count is in fact equal to 3, we log done, and then we break out from the loop, just like that. See? Perfect. So that's, right over there is how you would use the break keyword. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the next loop. And the next loop I want to talk about is the, I think, for loop, right? Okay, so the for loop is also another loop structure, and it's also a pretest loop. And it's also called a count controlled loop. And what that means is basically, when it comes to the for loop, you need to have you need to be able to, you're basically looping a certain amount of times. Like, so you're not going to loop an indefinite amount of times. You're going to be looping, n times, and n is going to be a fixed value. Okay, so let me actually show you guys the syntax for a for loop, which is right over here. Okay, so we have for, the keyword for, and then the parentheses, we have let I equal 0, I less than 100, I plus plus. Okay, these things should be very similar or familiar, but I'm going to explain what they are just for the sake of this tutorial. Okay, and then we have our body of the loop. Okay, perfect. And again, remember, pretest loop, all that means is that we always check the condition first before execution. So let's comment all this stuff out. And what we're going to do is we're going to implement the for loop down here. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to say for. We're going to declare a variable. So this is called the declaration and initialization stage, or the statement. So we're going to say for let I. You can also use var. Okay, let I equal 0. You can start at whatever number you want. It's up to you. Okay, but let's start at 0. Next, we want to loop 100 times, so our condition is going to be I less than 100. Okay, and this is the condition statement. Okay, then next we're going to have the incremental statement, which is just I plus plus. Basically, we're updating this value that we declared inside this for loop after every single iteration. And you can see it kind of looks a lot more cleaner because, you know, everything is all in one line. Okay, and let's just go ahead and just log all the numbers from 0 up to, let's do 1 to 100. So, and if we log this out, you're going to say it prints out all numbers from 1 to 100. So we kind of like, you know, implemented the same thing that we did earlier, but using a for loop. But let's walk through it though. Okay, so pretty much I is currently 1 during the first iteration. We check to see if I is less than or equal to 100. We check to see if this condition is satisfied. And since that's true, 1 is less than 100, or less than or equal to 100, we execute the body of the for loop. Okay, and we execute it, we print out 1, the value of I, and then after we're done with everything, I plus plus happens. So this part happens at the very end. Okay, and that's pretty much the for loop right there. Again, it's a count controlled loop. There's obviously differences, and I mean, ultimately, it's really, you can use a for loop for anything you want that you can use a while loop for. But there are certain differences, and there are certain situations where you might want to consider using a while loop instead of a for loop, and vice versa. Okay, so the last loop I want to cover, or I mean, it's the only last loop, is a DoWhile loop. Okay, now DoWhile loop is a little bit different, so we'll go into that. Okay, so the DoWhile loop is a post-test loop, which means that the body of the loop is going to be executed before we check the condition. Okay, so let's implement it. So this is what the syntax looks like: do, curly braces, and then the body, which is right over here, and then the while statement. And this is where the condition is. Okay, so let's do that. Let's say do, curly braces, that's the body, while, and let's go ahead and declare a variable. Okay, it's nice that I honestly like for loops because you can just do everything inside the parentheses. But of course, they have their time and place. So let's just declare a variable called I. And let's just have our condition go up to 50 for now. Okay, and let's just print out all of the values. Okay, so this is going to print from 0 to 49. Oh, whoops, I forgot to update the variable. There we go. 0 to 49. Okay, cool. And you might think, okay, well, this is kind of like the same thing, right? But let's do this. Let's actually change let's change the value that we assigned I to at line 20 to 51. Or actually 50. Okay, now we can see that the condition over here is not satisfied, right? It's false. 50 is not less than 50. Okay, so you're probably thinking, okay, well, this loop is not going to work at all. It's not going to execute at all. Well, let's run it. And if we execute it, you can see that it actually does print out 50. Okay, it logs 50 on line 22. And you're probably wondering, well, why is that the case? Okay, so remember how I said the DoWhile loop is a post-test loop? Basically, what that means is that the body is going to be executed before the condition is checked. So we're kind of like saying, okay, do this and then check this. Okay, so we log 50 to the console. We can see that 22, I'm sorry, not 22. We can see that we're logging 50 to the console, and then we're incrementing I by 1. Okay, and then we can see that that was also logged over here. And then we check to see if the condition is satisfied. And we can see that, well, I is currently 51. So 51 is definitely not less than 50. So since that's false, the loop terminates. And we continue on with the rest of the program. Okay? And so you're probably wondering, well, when would you want to use a do-while loop? And I guess a good reason to use a do-while loop is when you want to at least have the body of the loop execute once. Okay, and if that execution succeeds, let's say if it satisfies the condition for the next loop, then it's going to keep on going over and over again. So it's very good for like if you're developing interactive programs, that displays like a menu. They can select whatever, stuff like that. But we'll get to that when we like write programs that require input output or input from the keyboard. Okay. And a good reason to use a for loop is when you know in advance like how many times you want to loop. Let's say if I know I want to loop 5,000 times, then I would just use a for loop. And a good reason to use a while loop is, let's say if you don't know how many times you want to loop, just like this example over here. We don't know how many times we want to loop, but at some point we definitely want to terminate the loop at some point. Okay? And so you would use a while loop when you don't know how many times you want to loop. Okay, because it's going to keep going until you reach some breakpoint. But again, you can always use these loops however you want. You can use them as if they were like the same thing. Okay, but I just wanted to make sure you guys understood the differences between the three of these different types of loop structures. Okay, so I guess that's pretty much it with looping. I don't really have anything left to really say. I did have these other examples, but I felt like these were much better. So yeah, hopefully this clarified a couple things with loops. So again, if you guys have any questions, join my Discord server and just ask over there. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. So I will see you guys in my next video. Peace.